Welcome to the Salam Islamic Center and Pacific Institute's program with Craig Considine, the people of the book. Dr. Craig Considine is an award-winning professor and the best-selling author of The Humanity of Muhammad, a Christian View. He is recognized as an authority in interfaith dialogue, particularly Christian and Muslim relations. Dr. Considine has written 7 books for the field of Islamic studies, including People of the Book, Prophet Muhammad's Encounter with Christians, Muslims in America, Examining the Facts, and Islam, Race, and Pluralism in the Pakistani Diaspora. Throughout the years, Dr. Considine's peer-reviewed articles have appeared in Sociology and Religions, and his op-eds have been published in Newsweek and Foreign Policy. Dr. Considine's opinions appear regularly in the leading news and media outlets around the world. He also has experience in filmmaking, having directed the critically acclaimed documentary film Journey into America. Dr. Considine has spoken to audiences for Oxford University, the University of Edinburgh, Trinity College Dublin, the University of Dublin, and the Hamad bin Khalifa University in Doha. He is a practicing Roman Catholic with ancestral roots mainly in Saint Elia, Filippino, and Monachilon. Is that right? I made it. Italy and Liston, Varna, Ireland, but also England and Scotland. Craig is a native of Needham, Massachusetts. He holds a PhD in sociology from Trinity College Dublin, University of Dublin, an MSc London in International Relations from Royal Holloway, University of London, and a BA in International Relations from American University in Washington, D.C. This afternoon, he has also given us the good news that he's studying on one upcoming book. Hopefully, he'll tell us more about that. So with that, please help me welcome Dr. Considine.
Greetings, everyone. Peace be with you all. It's a pleasure to be here in Irvine. I think this is like my 7th or 8th trip to California to engage with communities, but this is the first in person in Irvine. And this is also following up on a Zoom session that we had done Pacifica Institute back in the darker days of COVID. But I would like to thank the Pacifica Institute, Attila and Ibrahim. Thank you so much for everything today. And of course, the Salam Islamic Center, and to all of you for being here this evening. And I'm hoping that we can have a lively Q&A after I share with you my latest piece of scholarship, which, as you know, is called People of the Book, Prophet Muhammad's Encounters with Christians. This book took me about 1.5 years to write, and it was my favorite book to research. It was very difficult to write, but it was very enjoyable to research. And the reason why is because I learned a great deal about my own faith, Christianity. And the stuff, the stuff that I learned was completely new to me. You know, it wasn't like I was getting a different version of Christianity that I was not given in Catholic school. In researching this book, I learned things that I had never knew even existed. To really understand the Christians of Muhammad's time, you have to go back into history. From the year 0. This is when Jesus passes. He's no longer present on earth. And as noted in the book, the scholars refer to this term, the Jewish Christians. The Jewish Christians were said to be the main, primary, authentic disciples of Jesus. And the Jewish Christians, you can hear it in the name, right? A Jewish Christian. Most people are saying, well, how can that be? But the term describes a people who were ethnically Jewish, religiously Jewish. They believed Jesus was the Messiah. Whether they believed he was the Son of God, different story. But essentially what the Jewish Christians were trying to do, they were trying to convert people who were already Jewish to Christianity. So they were trying to get people to buy into this idea that Jesus is the Messiah, but they weren't messing with Jewish law. The Jewish Christians were still practicing the halakha. Okay, James, cousin of Jesus, was the leader of the Jerusalem church, that first church. Peter, who many of you know, Peter was James's right-hand man for the Jerusalem church, but Peter left Jerusalem to evangelize elsewhere. So we have James, we have Peter, and then we have Paul. And Paul is quite an interesting character. Paul is Jewish, originally named Saul, and he has a moment on the road to Damascus. Light bulb goes off. He goes blind for 2 days, and God is speaking to him, saying, you need to stop persecuting the Christians. Paul converts to Christianity and no longer becomes an enemy of the Christians. However, Paul's idea about who Jesus was and what it meant to be a Christian was significantly different from what was coming out of the Jerusalem church. Paul is largely responsible for initiating the idea of the Trinity and spreading the idea of the Trinity to the Gentiles, to the non-Jewish people. Paul goes west, goes into Europe. James, Peter, and the Jerusalem church go east. Trinitarianism west, Unitarianism east. That is a bit of information that most Christians don't even know. I was never really taught that in school. It was just always the Trinity, and this is what it is, and this is the official doctrine. Okay, so we're still in the first century here. There are different ideas developing about who Jesus is. In the academic realm, we refer to it as Christology. Who is Jesus? And all of these different ideas are popping up. In the 2nd and 3rd century, there was a growing idea that God existed before Jesus did. Right? So this idea that God and Jesus are in union can't be. They can't be the same person. Because essentially the Unitarians are saying God created Jesus. And this position, I know this is very theological, but trust me, it's going to make sense. This idea was developed by Arius, a presbyter named Arius. And if you want to read more about that, I suggest you do. We're talking about the Unitarianism, more strict on God, a stricter monotheism. That idea lost out in the year 325 at the Council of Nicaea. This was the biggest public discussion and debate over the nature of Jesus in history. Arius and the strict monotheists lost, and the Council of Nicaea basically said the Trinity is the doctrine of the church. So unfortunately, the Christians got into the habit, which still persists in humanity today, of calling people heretics. You know, you're following the wrong creed, the wrong sect. And the Byzantine Empire at the time, right? So we're in 325, Byzantine Empire, Emperor Constantine, no relation. People think I'm related to him because my last name is Constantine. I don't think I am, at least. But they start persecuting. And what happens? Those Unitarians, those stricter monotheists, are kind of pushed east to the Arabian Peninsula. So when Muhammad comes, right, he's born in 570. you have a pretty diverse region of our world. To the north and to the west, you have the Byzantine Empire, the Trinitarians, the Council of Nicaea. To the east, you have the Zoroastrian Persian Empire, completely different religion. Juan Cole, a great professor in history at the University of Michigan, has written an excellent book, and I discuss it on the very first pages of my book. He says that Muhammad, again, in the 7th century, was in a Game of Thrones type of environment, named after the HBO show, Game of Thrones. Everyone is trying to capture the throne, right? So it's a struggle for power, for greed. So Muhammad is born in this time of empire, but also a lot of discussion about what it means to be a Christian and the nature of Jesus. Those Unitarians, I argue in the book, are largely the Christians that Muhammad countered, as told in the early Islamic sources. The book begins by talking about Bahira the monk in 582. So many of you might be familiar with this story. Muhammad, if you're not, I'll briefly explain it. Muhammad is a young boy, 12, traveling with his uncle on these trading caravan missions, right? And Bahira is said to have been a monk, a hermit of some sort. He had a little kind of cell. And essentially what happens is Bahira points out Muhammad for being a prophet. And the seal of prophecy or prophethood was found on Muhammad's body. Now, some scholars like Karen Armstrong and Fred M. Donner, they refer to these stories, they're tales, right? Others are saying, well, they happened. Regardless, it's interesting because, one, Muhammad was 12, being recognized for a future of greatness, but it was a Christian who was the first to recognize Muhammad's future prophethood. And I think that is interesting in itself. Now, scholars have wondered who is Bahira, right? If he's believing as a Christian in future prophecy, that challenges fundamental Christian teachings, right? Like Jesus came according to the Council of Nicaea, he's essentially the Son of God, and there's no prophets after that. So Muhammad was engaging, I think, and I talk about this in the book, in very interesting conversations on his travels. I refer to Muhammad as a cross-cultural navigator, right? So from a young age, again, on these trading caravan missions with Abu Talib, right up until his manhood, he was traveling to Petra, Gaza, Jerusalem, Busra, Damascus. If you go back into history and look at what these cities were when Muhammad was visiting them, you can start picturing what was Muhammad seeing? What was he experiencing? And I want to be careful here because I know how easily this argument can be misconstrued. Some folks, and I'm not one of these folks, like to say that Muhammad learned Christianity from, learned Islam from Christians, and that's where it essentially came from. That negates the divine connection. That's not what I'm saying. In 610, when the revelations began, I believe that is divine, right? I believe that is divine. However, could Muhammad also have had multiple in-depth conversations during his travels or elsewhere with Christians? I think that's completely reasonable. And I also talk in the book about his grandfather and great-grandfather. And some sources talk about how they were leading the way for these trading caravan missions long before Muhammad was even there. Even saying that some of his ancestors had connections to Abyssinia, which I'm going to get to in a second. So, as a young man, Muhammad, being a successful businessman, as a merchant, was interacted with Christians. And any successful businessman would have to have things like, dignity, respect, honor, the ability to communicate. And he was that type of person, making connections with people. So 610 happens. And while the angel Gabriel is not necessarily a Christian, per se, he is a very significant figure in the Christian tradition. And it was fascinating to learn how many times Angel Gabriel visited Prophet Muhammad in his life. There have been some studies done, up to 24,000 times Angel Gabriel visited Prophet Muhammad in some of the most important and dire times of his life. So Gabriel comes, of course, we know that the Quranic story of Jesus' miraculous birth through Mary and the biblical story, as outlined in the New Testament, is virtually the same, which is, inspiring. And that is an important area for common ground between Catholics and Muslims, Mary, of course. So 610, revelations begin. As you can imagine, Muhammad was probably quite confused about what had just happened. Karen Armstrong, the great biographer of Muhammad, calls it his moment of terror. He was genuinely afraid. It was a supernatural experience. So he goes home, we know, goes to Khadija. What does Khadija say? Khadija says, I know who we need to talk to. Waraka ibn Nawfal, also a Christian, probably a Jewish Christian as well. Some have even said that Waraka ibn Nawfal could have been the leader of a small Christian community in Mecca. Not a big, community with a big church, but like an underground space. And that shouldn't be surprising, really, because the Hashim clan, the Hashemites, right, with the Quraysh, they were the protectors of the Kaaba. And we know, according to early Islamic sources, that even at the end of Muhammad's life, with the preservation of the Jesus and Mary icon, that there was a presence of Christians in Mecca. So who was Waraka? Right? That's in 610. Waraka is basically saying to Muhammad, you are going to be the lawgiver of your people, but you're also going to face persecution, and you're going to suffer, as most prophets are, right? No prophet is ever welcomed in their home. So Waraka is undoubtedly a crucial figure. And I go back to my point as well with Muhammad's previous conversations with Christians. Waraka was very close to Khadija, Muhammad's wife. Muhammad and Khadija got married in 595. Certainly in 610, on the night of destiny, that wasn't the first time Muhammad had met Waraka. So was Muhammad and Waraka, were they actually engaging in conversations before this divine night happened? And I think it's important to recognize, you can recognize those two things, that Muhammad did have these encounters, had these conversations, interacted with different Christians on Christological debates. And then that night happened, and that kind of connected it all for him. And then he begins his mission, which is a revolutionary mission. Not just a prophetic mission, in my opinion. Muhammad was coming with a completely revamped idea of what it meant to be a human and how to live in society. Right? Mecca was hyper-tribal. The whole region was hyper-tribal. I mean, even things like, literally throwing away babies that were deemed to be infanticide, deemed to be useless or irrelevant. Women being treated as second-class citizens. So Muhammad comes, though after 3 years, right, after that first night of revelation, it took him 3 years to go public. And when he goes public, we know that he faces significant backlash. Now, I also talk about in the book, something extraordinary happened in the year 614, going back to Juan Cole's Game of Thrones scenario. The Persian Empire and the Byzantine Empire had been fighting for centuries. And the Persians marched across Mesopotamia, went to Jerusalem, and sacked Jerusalem. And they are said to have stole the true cross of Jesus That was in 614. How do you think Muhammad would have responded to the sacking of Jerusalem, which is a key feature of the Abrahamic monotheistic tradition? Who would Muhammad have been allies with? The Byzantines or the Persians? Again, Juan Cole makes a very convincing case that much of Muhammad's activities was in line with Byzantine interests as well. So that is 614. 615 comes, and we have perhaps my favorite story in the entire book with the First Hijra. Now, this is interesting because the Abyssinians, their capital was in Aksum. They have been long documented as retaining Jewish Christian practices. This is quite well documented. And you can easily find peer-reviewed journal articles on it. However, they also adhered to the Council of Nicaea. So they were Trinitarians, but they still maintained some of these Jewish Christian practices. Now, Muhammad obviously knew that King Ibn Abjar was a wise king, right? We also know that the Quran and the revelations Muhammad received is critical of the Trinity, agreeing more with that position developed by Arius and the Unitarians. But Muhammad did not become obsessed with the Trinity to the point where he didn't tell his people, don't go there, don't go to Abyssinia because they're Trinitarians. He said, go. It is there that you'll be taken care of, and we know through early Islamic sources that King Ibn Abjar didn't merely open the doors to the believers, to the Muslims. He did a lot more than that. One, they entered into a dialogue, right? Jafar, a close companion of Muhammad, is reading passages from Surah Maryam, right, of the Quran. And Jafar even says things like, King Ibn Abjar asks Jafar, like, who is Muhammad? And Jafar starts explaining who Muhammad is, and Jafar says things like, he brought us into humanity. He took us out of the darkness. And King Ibn Abjar, you can imagine hearing this. The sources say that he was so moved that he cried until his beard was wet, and that the scholars around him, Christian scholars, Trinitarians, cried until their scrolls were wet. But the best part of that story is the allyship. And I'm very explicit in my book with my sociological concepts. I mentioned earlier cross-cultural navigation, the concept of allyship, which is increasingly important, especially among our youth. I know we have youth here, and this is a term that is popping up in college courses and whatnot. But allyship. King Ibn Abjar, in front of the Quraysh, the enemies of the Muslims, actively defended those Muslims. He said that, not for a mountain of gold will I give these people up to you. He said it to the Quraysh's face. And then King Ibn Abjar turns to the Muslims and say, you're safe. You're safe here. Be at ease in my kingdom. It's such a monumental, powerful story. And the powerful stories continue. The book is really, I didn't mention this earlier, but it's a biography. It's a biography of Muhammad's life, told through the prism of his encounters with Christians. We also have, in 619, the year of sorrow, one of Muhammad's most difficult years, perhaps the most difficult. 2 years later, in 621, what ends up happening? The night journey to Jerusalem. Jerusalem emerges as the inspiration. The prophets emerge as the inspiration. That's highly symbolic. 622, we have the Constitution of Medina. Most folks who have a basic understanding of the Constitution of Medina, again, 622, believe that the primary political players in the city were Jewish tribes and pagan tribes, which is largely true. But scholars have also made convincing cases that there were Christians there as well. They didn't have a prominent presence, they didn't necessarily come to the table to make the Constitution of Medina, but they were there. And like, why would Muhammad grant all of these privileges and rights to Jews and pagans and not do it to Christians? Why would he do that? He probably wouldn't. The Constitution, I explain, creates a civic nation. So we have a community that is united not by race, culture, or even religion. What unites a civic nation are political rights. It's a legal document. And the Constitution of Medina provides freedom of religion, the right to worship, the right to own private property, the right to assemble. And even more than that, going back to allyship, the Constitution of Medina creates a society in which all of these tribes are mutually dependent upon one another, right? So if one enemy, the Quraysh, attack the Muslims, then everyone's got to come in. I mean, that's how this country works, right? This is a republic, ultimately. Instead of looking at each state as a state, you could look at it as essentially a tribe, right? States have their own sovereignty, but we're all connected to the Constitution. All right, so let's move to two more events. 630, another monumental event. Muhammad is emerging as an increasingly significant political player in the region, and he's reaching out to all of these different rulers around the Arabian Peninsula. One ruler, or one community of significance, was the Christians of Nudra, right? So this is occurring in the year 630. And in the book, I dedicate like 5 pages to the history of the Christians of Nudra. If you go back to the year 518, the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula was ruled by the Himyarites. It was a Jewish tribe. They may have been ethnically Arab, but they were religiously Jewish. And the Himyarites, under the leadership of someone called Du Nuwas, Dhunuwas. Under his leadership, they went on essentially a pogrom, a campaign to persecute the Christians in revenge for how the Byzantine Empire was treating Jews. So Du Nuwas was real petty. And early Islamic sources are referring to atrocities being carried out. Huge Christian communities being brought together, locked in churches, and then Du Nuwas and his leaders set the church on fire. The Quran even mentions, and this is all explicitly laid out in the book, even mentions rivalries between Christians and Jews, and even people being thrown into pits of fire. And Juan Cole, again, one of my favorite scholars here, he says that these Quranic verses are actually, they were revealed at a time in which this connection with the Christians of Nudra was happening. And one of the stories linked to this part of Muhammad's life deals with the Christological debate. So now I'm kind of coming full circle. We started with Christology and now we're back to Christology. And the Christians and Muslims essentially agreed to disagree on the nature of Jesus. But they didn't let these disagreements sour relations between one another. You know, it reminds me of my recent trip to Washington, D.C. Everyone's familiar with Senator Bob Dole. He recently passed away. Right. Joe Biden said in a speech, and I was on the National Mall at the World War II Memorial when I was watching this, and Joe Biden said that for 25 years, he and Bob Dole disagreed often on policy, but they were never disagreeable with one another. There's a difference there. You know, when someone is disagreeable, it's nasty, it's hostile, it's not productive. People are driven by rage and fear. So Muhammad was able to create this environment with the Christians of Nudra that was a healthy dialogue. And that's what we need. It's not possible for all human beings to ever agree on everything. I hope that never happens. That would just be like a total fascism of the world, I suppose. But they agreed to disagree. And the best part is that after, towards the end of this 3-day conference, Muhammad allows the Christians of Nudra to actually pray inside Masjid al-Nabawi. Now that is, even in the modern context, that's unthinkable. People don't do that, but he did it. What message is he sending? Now this is contentious as well, especially coming from me, a Christian. You know, some people are going to say, "Well, are you advocating for Muslims to open up every masjid door so Christians can pray?" That's not what I'm saying. What I think Muhammad was communicating to his people was being hospitable is an act of faith. I mean, who's the most hospitable person or entity in the universe? It's God, right? He's allowing all of this. And Muhammad had to understand that being hospitable it's a divine process. It's a divine state. And that state is the one that we should ultimately all work towards, something as simple as hospitality. So 2 more minutes as I approach 30 minutes. I think some of you may have read my previous book, The Humanity of Muhammad, A Christian View. In that, I distinguish between tolerance and pluralism. I don't think religious tolerance is enough anymore. We can't just tolerate each other. Now think of all the examples that I gave you in Muhammad's life, or even the First Hijra, right? Not directly related to Muhammad, but what we had in all of these cases is people going beyond a superficial kind of relationship with one another. We're talking about deeper meaning. I refer to it as pluralism, and I take the definition from Harvard professor Diana Eck, the energetic engagement with religious diversity. That's what we need. We need to move beyond merely just having these dialogues and forming deeper connections. And then lastly, I would like to end up with the final sermon. Now, Christianity or Christians were not mentioned explicitly in the final sermon, but this speech in 632 really captures, I think, the essence of Muhammad's mission and God's will. And it's an anti-racist message. It's blatantly advocating for racial equality. Now, you may think that that is not linked to Christianity, but it is. Because unfortunately, in some parts of the world, Christianity is like a racial identity. It's like the white European religion. So I suppose what I'm saying here, and this is a classic sociologist, don't forget that intersection. Even though Muhammad is talking about explicitly race in the final sermon, it does come back over and link to religion. So the book ends with a hope, essentially. Muhammad passes away in 632. Who does he see in heaven? Could he have seen Waraka ibn Nawfal in heaven? There's a hadith narrated by Aisha that talks about Muhammad saying that Waraka ibn Nawfal had 1 or 2 gardens in paradise. Now, imagine that, right? People of different walks of life, different religions, different faiths, meeting each other in heaven. I mean, is that possible? I would hope so. And I hope that we can find ways of not merely living with these differences, but being prophetic, following the example of someone like Muhammad. And you don't need to be a Muslim to do it. Following his teachings, his life, his legacy is certainly pertinent to resolving some of these social ills that we see in our country today. So his message is as important as ever, and he was engaging in repairing a broken world. There's a Hebrew phrase, you ever heard it? Tikkun ulam, to heal a fractured world. That's what Muhammad was doing. And that's what Jesus was doing as well. And that's why I respect Muhammad so much. So thank you all. I look forward to the Q&A. no question is off limits. Fire away. Yes.
So microphone, will be handing the microphone to the person who's asking the question. Is that right?
This is only for YouTube, and but everybody can listen to it.
Yeah, who's asking the question? Someone, is it okay if he holds the microphone?
What's that?
Holds the microphone?
Yeah.
Okay,
Well,
go ahead.
Dr. Considine, it was a pleasure hearing you in person. And I must say that, what I've read about you, what I've known about you has increased much more. Has
That's
increased
good.
much more after
Yes.
this discussion. A couple points very quickly. Most of the Muslims believe, if not all Muslims believe, that you mentioned Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. So at that time, obviously, thank you. At that time, obviously, Unitarianism in Christianity was shunned, and Trinity was set up as a set up for all futures. So most Muslims believe that Warqa ibn Nawfal was obviously, like you mentioned as well, was number one, was a Unitarian Christian, and number two, we also believe that when Council of Nicaea was held, some versions of Bible were discarded, and one of them was Bible in Arabic we call Barnabas.
Yes.
And in that version of Bible, there was a prophecy of the last messenger to come. And so, again, coming back to my original point, is that most Muslims believe that Warqa ibn Nawfal saw Prophet Muhammad as that Messiah or the last prophet.
Yeah.
So just wanted to bring it to your attention.
Yeah, so I refer to Warqa ibn Nawfal, according to my knowledge of the Jewish Christian branches, as an Elkasite. Elkesaite, an Elkasite. And these were Jewish Christians that believed in future prophecy, that prophethood was not dead. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls and all of these missing books from the Bible, I mean, I find it fascinating. I'm not a biblical scholar. I wish I could give you a more in-depth analysis of that, but I want to just bring up the concern with heresy. With something like Council of Nicaea happens, and like, what is it with human beings that we get into this game of blatantly condemning people for a belief? And this has gotten me into some hot water, because I believe in actions much more than I do beliefs. And I don't know how y'all feel about that. I understand belief is important, but if you had Unitarian Christians who are doing good and serving humanity, serving their communities, yet they just have this different belief over the nature of God. And let's see, these communities are successful. And if they're successful, well, who's giving them success? Had to be God, right? So unfortunately, it got politicized. Christology became politicized. And again, I didn't even get into Constantine here, but Constantine becomes the emperor in 313. Imagine, right? The Roman Empire. You have the leader converts the entirety of the empire to a different faith, Christianity. That's what Constantine did. And right around this time, he was also consolidating his power. That's why he wanted to hold the Council of Nicaea. Now, the element with the Trinity here, before we get to the next question, why the Trinitarianism? And this has been well documented in the scholarship. If you look at pre-Christian religions, especially around Europe, like Celtic religions, the idea of three is quintessentially important. I studied this when I was living in Ireland, right? So we had the Firbolgs, an ancient mythological group which was divine. They lived underground. On this ground, Earth, you had humans. And then above, you had the ultimate mystery. Why do you think the symbol of the Irish is a shamrock? 3 clovers. what did St. Patrick use to convert the pagans to Christianity? The shamrock. Now, I'm not going to get into the business of calling Constantine a heretic, but I am just laying out some of these potential historical realities that get us thinking about not only the nature of Jesus, but also how Islam lines up with different elements of Christianity. Yes, sir.
Thank you for the speech. My question is, when you are talking about, you mentioned a few times about the Islamic sources, right, in the book and in your talk. All the stories and everything, you know, about all these Islamic, you know, characters and, you know, stories. What we know of as Muslims is mostly from the Islamic, you know, historians. What do you know about those times in Christian or Jewish or, let's say, you know, Iranian or Persian historians or sources?
Speaking about
Muhammad. You know, all these events, you know,
yeah.
all the, you know, whatever happened, whatever you mentioned in the book, do they even talk about it? You know, like the Abyssinia, you know, you are talking about them. Because, you know, the history is written by the winners, right? I mean, when you talk about it, Islam grew and grew, and it is written by the Muslims. Everything that we know is written by them. But I'm just curious if there is any source other than Muslims about the Muslims.
It's a really great question and deserves to be studied by historians in depth, looking at, you know, where does the Abyssinian paperwork, what does it reveal about potentially the First Hijra? Haven't got into that specifically, but I will tell you my knowledge of how non-Muslims have written about Prophet Muhammad throughout history. One of the earliest documentations is of John of Damascus in the 800s, I believe. And this was the classic kind of anti-Muhammad line of him being not only a heretic, but something much worse. And then these ideas, you know, kind of carried into likely the Crusades. One person I do talk about in the book, anyone heard of Michael Servetus, a 15th century theologian, killed during the Inquisition by the Catholic Church for his Unitarian beliefs. He didn't necessarily mention Muhammad explicitly, but if you read what Servitus wrote about the nature of God, you can kind of imagine he and Muhammad being in tune. Martin Luther had some unfortunate things to say about the Islamic tradition and Muhammad. However, in recent years, you know, I'm not alone in having these views. A lot of people are like, are there other Christians that actually speak of Muhammad in this light? And yes, there are. For example, anyone familiar with Hans Kung, may he rest in peace, a Swiss theologian who was basically exiled from the Vatican. He could no longer officially teach Catholicism as kind of outlined by the Catholic Church because he believes in Prophet Muhammad's prophethood. That wasn't the only reason why he was, again, criticized for being a heretic. William Montgomery Watt, some of you may have read his books. He was writing back in the 1950s. Big professor at the University of Edinburgh. Similar train of thought that I've provided you here. So that is an interesting angle to look at too. Like, how have Christians themselves looked at Muhammad and described Muhammad throughout the years? I'd be less familiar with that documentation that you're asking for, but that's very interesting and worthy of studying for sure. I try not to paint too of a romanticized version of these early Islamic sources because they are very favorable to Muhammad, but I am critical of them in the book too. You know, bringing in a little bit more rationality. We had a question, yes, sir.
Hold on, please. Thank you very much. It was very beneficial. I really enjoyed your book, and it was eye-opening. One thing that I recall, I might have missed it, but there is no mentioning about the Christians in Taif and him encountering Addas. Was it purposely done, or did I miss anything?
It's not in the book. What year was that? Do you know? I think it was towards the end. I think I ran into a problem not a problem, but the fifth chapter of the book gets into more of like Muhammad's quarrels with the Byzantine Empire. And I deal with those very carefully. I deal with his encounter with Heracles, the emperor of the Byzantine Empire. I also get into the significant battles that they had. So is the book necessarily exhaustive of all of the encounters? I would say that would be going too far. And also remember, what about all the stories that weren't documented? What I'm most interested about is what he saw from 595 to 610 in traveling these different cities. What was he seeing? What kind of Christians was he interacting with? How did that inform him accepting this massive calling that he took on in 610 with the divine message? The Battle of Mu'tah, which was the big battle that Muhammad engaged in with the Byzantines, devastating loss for Muhammad and the believers, going up against the greatest army, arguably, of the time and region. Anti-Muslim or anti-Islamic critics like to use the Battle of Mu'tah as a fact or a reality of this historical antagonism between Christianity and Islam. But I don't think that is a wise approach to say that this battle, this war, spilled over because of theological differences. I mean, Muhammad's diplomat was literally murdered by a tribe called the Ghassanids, which is in kind of modern day Jordan, just south of like the Hijaz. And I mean, what was Muhammad going to do? I mean, imagine if a U.S. ambassador or diplomat was murdered abroad. I mean, it's happened. It's happened plenty of times. And like, how would you respond? Not turn the other cheek. They dealt with it. And they ultimately paid for it quite dearly. So there's some nuance to some of these historical stories as well.
Thank you so much for being here. I have a quick question. I want to ask about your personal experience about writing about another faith. Reading so much about it. Just a quick example, like a few months ago, I was reading, I'm a Sunni Muslim, I was reading about Shia Muslims, and I was telling my husband about it. And then he's like, are you sure you want to read that? I mean, like, isn't that, how did you deal with that, being scared or, it's very courageous, I think, to read so much and dive so much into another religion as a believer of another faith. So how was it like for you?
Oh, great question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't mean to be disrespectful, but I don't think it's courageous. I really don't. I mean, there are a lot more courageous people who do a lot more life and death things than I do. So a shout out to the courageous. But I mean, the journey for me was always about knowledge. I didn't walk into Dr. Akbar Ahmed's classroom at American University in 2004 looking for a faith. I was basically, at the time, I was pretty agnostic. I grew up in a very secular home. And I became almost offended when I started learning about the truth and when I was able to start separating fact from fiction, essentially scholarship from the media, because that's where a lot of the misinformation is coming from. So I took it personally. I almost felt duped. Like I felt my head and my heart were not true to me, because I had been fed all this stuff. So I became passionate about searching for knowledge. And let me be clear too, I'm not merely talking about the type of scholarship and knowledge that you get in reading People of the Book or writing peer-reviewed journal articles. There is a deeper knowledge that comes through human interaction. You know, spending time with people. You know, as a sociologist, I like to do ethnographies where you spend years with people, studying, you know, spending time with them. So that's what keeps me going. It's a love of knowledge. And it just so happened that like Islam and Christian-Muslim relations put me on this road. But for other people, it could be something non-religious. And I don't really think I necessarily chose this path. I mean, I'm not, well, maybe I'm saying divine intervention here, you know? I mean, I do believe that, you know, this is part of what I'm supposed to do on earth. This is my service to humanity. We were talking earlier too, like how do I deal with critics? There's a lot of critics, non-Muslims, Muslims, and so on and so forth. And I remind myself, what am I here for? I'm here for knowledge. I'm here for bridge building. And I remind myself every time I see a negative comment, there's going to be a positive comment. Every time you make an enemy, let's go out and make 20 friends. So I'm just scratching the surface. I mean, I could talk about the personal angle forever, but that is a broad historical overview and perhaps some insight on how to navigate these type of things.
So with the diversity, equity, and inclusion that we're all learning about more right now, what do you think about like the faiths coming together, like the interfaiths that we're having? You know, what's your perspective beyond the tolerance?
Yes, so
Thank you.
as I mentioned, I like the term pluralism. That's the term I'm settling on now to push us beyond tolerance, excuse me. Now I have an acronym to activate pluralism, to move beyond the tolerance, and it stands for DEUCE, like peace sign. And it's a step-by-step process. I would love to like be in charge of an organization and like unleash this. But here's what it stands for: dialogue, education, understanding, commitment, and engagement. Nothing can happen if we don't talk to one another, obviously. But the dialogue should not begin by talking about religion or race or ethnicity. It should begin by talking about things that are more common to the human experience. Being a dad, a mom, a friend, a colleague, even a citizen, right? Like if you don't have those type of very humbling conversations with people, are you going to build enough trust to get into the proper education? You know, this is one of the problems with interfaith dialogue, right? We bring strangers together from two different places of worship. And I've seen some interfaith dialogues, there's just tables, and there's just a Bible and a Quran just sitting there. These are complete strangers, most of whom have probably never properly studied these texts. And what are we expecting? You know, the light bulb to go off? We need to build deeper, more authentic relationships, and I really do think it starts by focusing on our humanity. So the dialogue happens, the education. This is when we can properly get into the texts. The understanding is when the friendship, I think, reaches a different level. kind of going to the Christians of Nudra, you can agree to disagree. You understand each other. You know, you're in tandem. The commitment then is outlining what we stand for. You know, what do you stand for? What do I stand for? And where is the common ground of our commitment, our principles? And then the E is about engagement. And that's when you work with these communities in the public sphere together, not separately, but together, and then you become this example for the world to follow. I think that is a good start. It hasn't been tested. I haven't implemented it yet, but I think people are especially responsive to the dialogue. Breaking that down even further. And then also, let me end with this, especially with the youth. You know, I teach at Rice University, pretty liberal university. Students are quite active, you know, and a lot of the issues sometimes are deeply rooted in identity categories, these really narrow categories of identity and everything associated with them. And sometimes I think these can be barriers. We have to, as Muhammad did, we have to transcend this kind of tribal thinking, these categories. And we have to create something even more inclusive, more inspiring and sacred. So that's how I would operationalize pluralism.
Thank you. You mentioned 60 Christians from Najran, and they were there for 3 days. And the highlight of their meeting, when they asked Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that who's God? And then he didn't answer that, and the revelation came, chapter 112, Surah Ikhlas, or the sincerity. And that chapter categorically mentioned there's only one God. God doesn't have a son. He's not a father of anyone. He doesn't need those kind of relationships. My question to you is that do you believe in one God and Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was a true prophet?
Yes, and I've long said that I believe Prophet Muhammad is a prophet. I've explained elsewhere my definition of a prophet as well. I am a monotheist. I don't believe that the Trinity should be a requisite of faith. However, I believe in the essence of the Trinity. I believe in God, I believe in Jesus, and I definitely believe in the Holy Spirit because I feel it. But I kind of lean more towards what Arius was saying, the guy that lost the Council of Nicaea, basically saying that, you know, before Jesus was God, and that ultimately, you know, if we were to make like a triangle, which is a Trinity, right, what would be on top of that triangle? God. And then it branches down to the two lesser elements of this essence, of this divine nature, which is the Trinity, and which is the Holy Spirit and Jesus. So that's very unconventional, though. That is not a normative, orthodox Christian position, but that's my position. And I'm not necessarily I'm not trying to be unorthodox, and I'm not trying to be orthodox. I'm just trying to be true to my senses and my knowledge. And that's where I stand. So yes, I do believe Muhammad is a prophet. And it's not explicitly laid out in people of the book, but in the humanity of Muhammad, it is. But a lot of people are upset because I also have a hard time believing, and I apologize if this offends anyone, I don't believe he's the final prophet. I don't think God is done with us. And that's my position.
Some of the historical sources mention that there were a group in northern Arabia that consisted of Arabs, of followers of Jesus who had been excommunicated by the Byzantine Church, some Jewish followers of Jesus, etc., who were trying to maintain a monotheistic faith, and they were called Hanifs.
Mm-hmm.
Also, there's, I think, in Ibn Ishaq's Sirat al-Rasul, mentioned that at the time of Muhammad, there were 3 or 4 other men who were known as Hanif
Yes.
also. I think one was Abu Zaid, who,
Yes.
as I recall, stands up and shouts to the people and they're saying, "O Quraysh, get yourselves a religion, for you have none." And so, could you comment on the Hanif and that little history there?
Yes.
How did that feed into Muhammad's life and understanding as well?
I would say so, and I deal with this in the first chapter. There's an entire section on the Hanif. Yes. So yeah, it's this idea. Like, could it be the Unitarians? The people that had the faith, the true faith that had been potentially lost. And Waraka ibn Nafal, who I mentioned when we were talking about the Night of Destiny in 610, he would have been one of these figures, these Hanif. And when I think about the word Hanif, like, part of me veers into the term believer. And I also want to make a comment here, because I think this is potentially useful. I write in the book that sometimes I refer to Muhammad's people not as Muslims, but as believers. Right? The Constitution of Medina is an example of this. Right? So, can we, and perhaps I'm saying this as a Christian, can we believe in Muhammad and still not identify him as a prophet? Because that's really difficult for people to do. And I don't expect all Christians now, for the light bulb to go off after reading this book and say, hey, we need to identify Muhammad as a prophet. That's not it. But can you believe in Muhammad? Absolutely you can. If you're only going to look at it theologically, then there might be some differences. But can you believe in Muhammad as a nation builder? Can you believe in Muhammad as an anti-racist, or as a women's advocate, as a statesman, as a diplomat? Yes, you can do all those things. And that's really what I'm trying to bring out in this book. I'm a sociologist, and trying to show people the human side of Muhammad, instead of diving into the Old Testament and theology. Why don't we look at someone's example and the stories? The book is just stories. That's what it is, with an academic twist. And this is crucially important, because what we're seeing, I think, across this nation is an increasing distrust and even disdain for religion. Not just Christianity or Islam, but religion. One of the reasons why I veered away from the faith that I was brought up in is because I didn't see why it mattered. When they were teaching us about Jesus, when I was at St. Sebastian's School in Needham, it was largely the theology. But we didn't hear about all of these stories of humanity. If I did hear them, maybe that could have informed my everyday life, my behavior. And sir, the last thing I want to say too, you mentioned the term engagement, right? I dedicated this book to Pope Francis, who has had a huge impact on how I see myself as a Christian and how I live my Christianity. And he uses the term culture of encounter. And I quote this in the introduction, and this isn't a verbatim quote, but he's essentially saying that this culture of encounter is not just about listening, but it's about hearing, right? So it's going beyond this kind of, I'm sitting here listening to you and I'm nodding, but like, am I really understanding? Am I really hearing you? And he even says, Pope Francis, instead of just walking by people and saying hi, like, stop with them, spend time with them. A handshake, a smile. Even Muhammad said, a smile is a form of charity. So just these little things, we have to get back to the basics. I truly believe that true change especially in the interfaith realm, is going to happen with these micro examples within communities and first within ourselves, right? And we need to move away from expecting the world to fix itself. Governments fixing our problems, politicians, organizations fixing our problems. Like, what if we started working on properly fixing our problems? Taking ownership, using our agency as well.
Well, with that, thank you very much, Dr. Considine.
Thank you, Attila.
Well, we can continue with the one-on-ones. Well, thank you, Dr. Considine, for this wonderful speech, and the Q&As was great, but we have some books over there, and we're going to do some book signing. You can purchase the books over there, and Dr. Considine is going to be here signing the books. But before we do so, we have a small present for you.
Oh, God. Every time I'm hanging out with the Hizmet community, I leave with like so many gifts, I can't even get them in my luggage.
Yeah. Well,
thank you, my friend.
This one and a teacup.
Thank you so much.
Enjoy the good times.
Thank you so much. Very kind of you. Thank you.
You're welcome.